Squire Trelawney, Dr. Livesey and the rest of the gentlemen have asked me to tell of our voyage in the Hispaniola to find Captain Flint's treasure. It all started one afternoon in the year 1723. A drunken old seaman arrived at the Admiral Benbow Inn, which was being run by my widowed mother and myself. He was the dirtiest and meanest of rascals we had ever come across. He arrived outside the Admiral Benbow with a large sea chest. He then took up lodging with us. All he told us of himself was that he was a sea captain, and so we called him the captain. One day he took me aside and offered me a silver threepence each week if I would keep a weather eye out for a seaman with one leg. He seemed extremely frightened of this individual. Each day the captain would go on the cliff top and look out to sea through his telescope. Then one day a tough-looking individual turned up. He forced his way into the inn demanding to see the captain. He waited hidden behind the door until the captain returned. They argued. The captain had stolen something and refused to give it back. The argument ended with the captain chasing the man down the street waving his cutlass. A short while later a blind man approached the Admiral Benbow. This I later learned was Blind Pew. He talked with the captain, then pressed a piece of paper into his hand. The captain went pale and started to shake. The captain was terrified. The one-legged seaman knew where he was and there was no escape. The Admiral Benbow was being watched. On the paper there had been a time 10 p.m. the following evening. In his desperation the captain drank huge quantities of rum and went around the inn waving his cutlass. He sat down in a chair. He then clutched at his chest and fell off the chair. Dr. Livesey, who was in the bar, rushed over, felt for a pulse and declared him dead. The captain being such a troublesome individual, my mother's first thought was for the outstanding money he owed us. So we set about searching his room. As it was by then nearly 9 p.m., we and the drinkers from the bar left as quickly as possible. Not left a moment too soon. As we escaped we could hear a gang of cutthroats breaking down the door of the inn. We hid under a pack-horse bridge. Meanwhile a villager rode his horse to fetch help. Luckily a group of customs men came to our aid. They ran their horses into some of the men, killing them, and the rest ran away. Mother and I were taken to the squire's house. Here we examined a map that had been among the captain's possessions. It bore the name of Captain Flint, a much feared pirate now dead. It was a treasure map. Squire Trelawney, a rich local landowner, agreed to sponsor a voyage to the island on the map. He found us a sailing ship named the Hispaniola. The squire came across an amiable one-legged sea cook named Long John Silver. At first I was worried that this was the one-legged man of whom the captain was so afraid. However, the squire assured me that Long John was the most gentle of souls and was not the same man. I had not then realized what a poor judge of character the squire was. The squire proved to be hopeless at obtaining supplies or enlisting seamen for the voyage. However, Long John Silver, our cook, took over. He told the squire that he had many friends who were able seamen. They turned up just prior to us setting sail. They were the toughest group of men that I had ever seen, but Long John knew how to handle them. I bid farewell to my mother and the ship departed. Our adventure had begun. Long John and I soon became the closest of friends, and I spent many an hour helping him in the galley. He had a very talkative parrot which he called Captain Flint. Captain Flint was the most annoying of creatures. I slept in the galley, and Flint's endless squawking of pieces of eight kept me awake half the night. In the middle of the night, having been driven half mad by this loathsome bird, I realized I was hungry and ventured below deck. Then I remembered that Dr. Livesey had insisted on having a large barrel of apples aboard to ward off the scurvy. By now we had been weeks at sea and must be getting close to our destination. The barrel was much depleted with only a handful left, so I climbed inside to get them. Then I heard footsteps. Their stealthy approach somehow told me whoever it was did not want to be seen or overheard. So I crouched in the barrel and stayed silent. The men gathered around my barrel and started talking in whispers. They knew all about the treasure map, as they had once been members of Captain Flint's pirate crew. They planned to mutiny, take over the ship and kill anyone who got in their way. Once the villains had departed, I climbed out of the barrel and hastened to tell Dr. Livesey and the squire what I had heard. To my horror, I suddenly realized that my friend Long John was the one-legged man who had so frightened the captain back at the Admiral Benbow. The very next day we arrived at our destination, a tropical island in the middle of nowhere. Being young and foolish, I had come up with a plan. Steal the treasure map from the captain's cabin, then obtain one of the ship's rowing boats and set off to find the treasure myself. The details of this plan, however, were somewhat vague. Thinking ahead is not something 14-year-old boys do. I was soon spotted and a rowing boat loaded with Silver's men had been launched. Hidden from view, I watched the crew as they searched for me. Not all of those who came over from the Hispaniola were Silver's men. 2 were honest seafarers who had been hired before Silver joined us. In horror, I watched as my former friends slit their throats. When it was safe to do so, I walked further along the beach. To my surprise, I found a single line of footprints in the sand. There ahead was a man in ragged clothing. Obviously not one of the crew but a castaway. Perhaps from a previous shipwreck. Meanwhile, on board the Hispaniola, Silver's men had broken into the ship's hold. They had helped themselves to the rum and were fighting among themselves. Dr. Livesey, the squire and the remaining loyal seafarers had taken advantage of this, loading one of the remaining rowing boats with provisions and heading toward the island. The doctor remembered seeing a stockade on the map, presumably built years before by Captain Flint. The pirates on the ship had stopped fighting. They had loaded the cannons and were firing upon the rowing boat. However, the grog, rough sea and long range meant that every shot missed its target. My new companion was Ben Gunn. Poor Ben had been marooned on the island for 4 years. Loneliness had unhinged his mind. For some reason he kept going on and on about his love of cheese. He even searched me to see if I had any. Ben took me to a place where he had hidden a boat made from a hollowed-out tree trunk. This later proved to be very useful. Ben took me along the beach to Flint's old stockade, where I could rest and gain shelter. I thought I was to be alone but found the doctor, squire and some of the remaining faithful seamen from the Hispaniola. As soon as dawn came, Silver's men charged the outer wall of the stockade, scaling it and dropping into the courtyard, straight into our line of fire. When he had ordered the building of the stockade, Flint had known what he was doing. There was a killing zone between the stake wall and ourselves in the wooden blockhouse. The pirates were dropping like flies. To avoid a total bloodbath, Long John could be heard calling his men to retreat. Although the pirates had lost a good many men, I doubted that they had given up. What were they up to now? One of the seamen suggested that they may be planning to bring over one of the ship's cannons. That got me thinking. Suppose some brave fellow went over to the Hispaniola, cut the anchor rope and set her adrift. You can guess what brave fellow I had in mind. That this impetuous deed risked the vessel drifting off never to be seen again never crossed my mind. That was when I remembered Ben Gunn's hollowed-out tree trunk boat. I found Ben's improvised boat easily even though it was getting dark. I then paddled out to the Hispaniola. Cutting through a thick anchor rope whilst sitting in a bouncing hollowed-out tree trunk proved to be impossible, especially as I had only been able to find a kitchen knife. Reluctantly, I decided to climb on board in the hope of finding something better. Once on deck, I was shocked to find dead and mortally wounded pirates. They had worked themselves into a drunken rage and that had led to wholesale slaughter. I cut the anchor rope with a sword belonging to one of the dead men. The Hispaniola gave a lurch and shot off at great speed. There was a pistol lying on the deck. I picked it up and took the ship's wheel. One of the pirates was not as dead as he had appeared to be. He was trying to sneak up on me. There was a blood-stained knife in his hand. His intentions were very clear. I left the wheel and began to climb the rigging. Climbing rigging was not one of my duties and the height made me giddy. However, somehow I managed to reach the crow's nest and was relieved to find that I still had my pistol. I was surprised when the pistol fired. I had not had the opportunity to check if it was loaded. Although the pirate would have happily slit my throat, I did feel slightly guilty at having shot him. The ship gave a sudden lurch, almost catapulting me into space. Luckily we had not hit a reef which would have put a hole in the ship, but rather a sandbank. It took me a long time to wade through the sandbank. I climbed over into the stockade and got a nasty shock. The stockade was now inhabited by Long John and his cronies. I feared that the Dr. Squire and the others were dead. However, that was not the case. Long John, under a white flag, had persuaded them to hand over the treasure map in exchange for a truce and the promise that they could go to another part of the island unmolested. Long John swore that he had kept this promise. We set off next morning to find the treasure. I could not help but wonder why the map had been handed over so readily. When we eventually reached the place marked upon the map, all we found was an empty hole. Someone had stolen our treasure. The pirates had so far had a certain respect for Long John, and some of the crew even feared him. However, the complete loss of the treasure after all of their hardships made them turn on him like rabid dogs. They approached us, threatening to hang us both from the nearest tree, cut us up into small pieces and use us for fish bait. I was somewhat surprised that Long John was more worried about my safety than his own, suggesting that they needed to keep me alive as a hostage in case any British gunboats turned up. Just then there was a rustling in the undergrowth and 2 loud pistol shots rang out. A couple of Silver's men clutched at their chests and fell to the ground. We had been saved in the nick of time. The Doctor, Squire and remaining loyal seamen had set a trap. Ben Gunn had found the treasure and moved it to a new location 2 years prior to our arrival. The Doctor had spoken with Ben and found this out, which was why the map had been handed over. The remaining pirates had fled into the deep undergrowth. We went in the opposite direction to the cave where Ben had hidden the gold. Rounding up the remaining pirates would have been dangerous. The tide would soon be turning and we must be off. As the Hispaniola passed along the shoreline, we saw the pirates waving and pleading for us to take them with us. But we sailed on. Meanwhile, Long John played upon our former friendship. I was still a child and easily taken advantage of. I borrowed the key to his chains and turned him free. I even got him a bag of gold to take with him. The Doctor and the Squire must have known who had freed Long John but chose to ignore it. He had kept his word and had not killed them after they handed over the map. So they did not wish to see him hang. I look back with affection on those events of 20 years ago. I returned home and found my mother waiting for me on the quayside. After expenses there was £700,000 to be shared out. So we were all very wealthy. Mother and I bought the Admiral Benbow from our landlord. The good Doctor set up a practice in Harley Street in London. The Squire became a Member of Parliament and Ben Gunn spent his share in 6 months. Being a sailor and having been alone on an island for 4 years, I can guess where it went. As for Long John Silver, I came across him sometime later and he greeted me like a long-lost brother. He was the landlord of the Jolly Roger in Robin Hood's Bay. When I mentioned the high quality and reasonable cost of the rum I was drinking, he smiled, gave me a wink and slapped me on the back. Old habits die hard, Jimmy me lad.